What is up, everyone? I am TST's the Mudman, and it's time to figure out what we are going to play this weekend ranked in Gods Unchained. But it's also time to go to the Gods Unchained Discord and vote on the Council of Mortals. I'm nominated, as well as my teammates Caution Fun and the Professor, and we'd really appreciate it if you went over there and showed your support. There will be a convenient link in the description of this video. But let's get back to it. So another week has gone by and we have not gotten any balance patches. So the meta is exactly the same as it's been for the past month. Light is the most popular domain by far, and then there's everybody else. Light's most common archetype is Zoo Light. However, Control Light is their strongest archetype, but Control Light is much more expensive than Zoo Light, so Zoo Light is way more common. Nature is almost exclusively aggro nature. You could be mid-range nature leaning aggro, but generally if you want to be nature, you have to be fast enough to beat your light opponents. Deception can be control or aggressive. However, aggressive deception is probably the most common deception archetype. Magic's most common archetype is Control Magic, very strong against all those aggro light players. Death's most common archetype is obviously Anubians. It's pretty much Anubians or nothing for Death. And then War is some sort of relic-oriented war deck, probably with a relatively low curve. The low curve relic war decks are most popular nowadays, but they could always go up to 7 with demos. But now that we've done this brief overview of the meta, let's jump into some specific decks that you might want to play this weekend ranked. Alright, so let's start things off with Light. Today I have an aggressive Light list as well as a control Light list to go over because Light is the best god in the game currently. We're going to start things off with the Zoo Light list because Zoo Light is the most popular archetype in the game. Last week I went over why Zoo Light and Control Light are good in vivid detail. This week I'm going to go over it a bit faster, so if you need more light in your life, check out last week's video to get thoroughly filled in. But without further ado, let's talk Zoo Light. So the Zoo Light strategy is fairly simple. They spend their first couple of turns playing cheap creatures, many of which have protected, and then they buff everything up with Radiant Dawn, then they buff everything up with whatever they have at 4 mana, then they buff everything up with Prayer of the Desperate, and then finally with Asterius, and it's just too many stats and the opposing god will eventually explode. There's a lot of redundancies, lots of great early mana creatures, lots of great buff cards. It's very difficult to miss, and it makes Zoo Light an incredibly powerful, aggressive archetype in the meta currently. But that's about it for aggro Light. Let's take a look at some control Light. This control Light list was made by Ryan. He went 16 of 18 with this list last week. And just like I said in the beginning of the video, Control Light is probably the strongest archetype in the meta right now. This list that Ryan made is very stall-oriented. We have lots of order-centric cards in order to just slow down the game state, as well as some pseudo-sleep cards in Line of the Sand. And then you use your infinite value gimmick, which is of course your inescapable duty, as well as Radiant Bomber, to just play creatures indefinitely. So you're essentially just stymieing your opponent's aggression and then just playing creatures until you inevitably win. It's very difficult to outvalue an opponent that can make infinite resources. It's very hard to control an opponent that can make infinite resources, and it's very hard to be aggressive against an opponent that can turn off your creature so easily with all the various order effects that can be brought back indefinitely through cards like Radiant Bomber. So, just like last week, the week before that, and the week before that, both Zoo Light and Control Light are fantastic archetypes. If you want to play either of these light decks this weekend ranked event, you will definitely do very well. And next up we have Relic War. This Relic War list was made by Yawgmoth, and Relic War is a very good archetype in the meta right now, because it's probably the only archetype in the game that's good against both Zoo Light as well as Control Light. It's not a great matchup, it's not like a guaranteed win against Zoo Light, but there are very few decks that can beat both of the light archetypes currently, and Relic War is one of them. I discussed the reasons why in great detail last week, so just like I said with the light video, if you want even more info about why War is good, check out last week's video, but I will go over it again just in slightly less detail right now. The reason why these War decks are good against Zoo Light is because you have a lot of different ways to get 2-for-1s. All of your Blitz creatures and Blitz Twin Strike creatures, like Wolf Cult Vanguard, can destroy 2 creatures, for your just single card. Your relics like Blade of Styx obviously have 2 durability, which means it can destroy 2 creatures for 1 card. And then cards like Bar Fight, Auric Rush, as well as Savage Strike can obviously destroy multiple creatures for 1 card. And although Zoolite is really great at making board states, they're really bad at drawing cards. So if you can run them out of resources, you might be able to just beat them the old-fashioned way. And the way you would beat Control Light decks is with the deck's primary win condition of make a big relic with unrestrained power and go face until they explode. One of the reasons why these Relic War decks are so good in the light matchup are also because of these 1-mana AoEs. When you combine them together, they're really good for dealing with Light's early board state. Their Summon Acolyte ability makes 2/2s. Many of Light's creatures are 2/2s or 1/1s with Protected. So doing 1 damage to each creature twice is often enough to clear their early game board state. You can then clear it again with Carnage Sweep. Lots of convenient stuff like that. And then when you're playing against Control Light, you just play any of your relics in the as early as you can, and then buff them up with unrestrained power and try to go face twice, and then use your god power or your creatures to get the rest of the way there. Essentially, this is a very explosive deck. It's capable of dealing a lot of damage at one time, and because of all of its 1-mana AoE and blitz creatures, it's fairly good at being defensive and controlling the board state. Some interesting notes about Yawgmoth's deck in comparison to other Relic War decks is there are no copies of Out of Its Misery. Out of Its Misery. I get that confused with Lost in the Depths all the time, which is very common in these war decks because the curve is so low. If you play Out of Its Misery on something like an Encumbered Looter, you should be able to draw something that you can play. It's probably going to be a 1-mana creature or a 2-mana creature, so you can have a big tempo swing. Yawgmoth also has all 3 copies of those 1-mana AoE spells. Most decks run 2 copies of Barfight and 2 Savage Strikes, the 2 better of the 1-mana AoEs, but they are incredibly useful, so Yawgmoth figured why not put 2 more in, and I'm sure that works out very well. And then the other thing of note for Yawgmoth's war deck compared to others is usually with these low curve war decks, you have 4 relics, 2 Blades of Styx, and then 2 4-mana relics, whether it be Devouring Blade or Scythe of the Harvest. But Yawgmoth has thrown in 2 Magic Missile Launchers, which usually are only in the higher curve Relic War decks, but it's just more relics to have, more targets for your unrestrained power, and you'll just be able to win the games faster because you'll be more likely to draw one of your relics, which is essentially one of your win conditions. So if you want to beat up on all those light players over the weekend, then a Relic War deck like this could be a great choice for your weekend ranked run. And now let's move on to Control Magic. This Control Magic list was made by Single Question Mark, and this Control Magic list is very similar to the Control Magic list we've been showing for this past month. It's very good against aggressive light decks. It has a lot of single target removal as well as AoE. We've got the Blizzard Bolts, the Star Shard Bolts, the Tracking Bolts, the Lightning Talismans, the Unannounced Arrivals, the Crystal Rains, the Shape Blast. You get the picture. Lots of cards that just clear the board and stop your light opponent from playing lots of creatures and buffing them up. And then we have some high mana creatures to end the game. We have 2 copies of City Planner, some big bodies, 2 copies of Healing Elite, also big bodies. We even have a copy of Mormag, the big dragon. I personally have never experimented with this card. It seems like it's too hard to pull off, but apparently I've seen a lot of people play this card very successfully. It's an 8-mana 8/8 with Roar. If you have 8 cards in your hand, deal 8 damage to each enemy character. So when this is in your hand, you need 9 cards. So this only activates if you have an absolutely full hand. If the effect resolves, it's insane. You clear your opponent's board and deal 8 damage to face. And this Single Question Mark here did manage to get 16 out of 18 wins last weekend, so this does seem like a fairly consistent thing, and generally the strategy is very linear. You ramp a little bit, you draw some cards, you clear your opponent's board, and you win the game. One colorful card to note is we have a single copy of Palace's Incantation in here, which its primary effect is pretty much useless. Transform each creature that costs 6 or more into a 1/1 rat. That doesn't do very much, but its secondary effect is where it really shines. You also obliterate all creatures in both voids. So this is obviously good against the Nubians because they're Nubians, but it also just single-handedly defeats your Control Light opponent. Control Light is not the most popular archetype. That being said, Control Magic really has no business beating Control Light. However, if you take all the creatures out of both players' voids, then there's nothing to Inescapable Duty, and then Control Light doesn't really have a gimmick anymore. So if you want to play Control Magic and you do not want to lose the Control Light, then you might want to slot in a Palace's Incantation. Or if you want to just ignore Control Light and pretend they don't exist, a list like this with lots of removal and then big beat sticks at the end should be very successful if you want to play Magic and you're down for some slow, grindy games. Alright, and next up we have Nature. It's been a couple of weeks since we've even talked about Nature, but it's been about a month since we've had a balance patch, so why not bring up a nature deck? And this aggro nature deck was made by two question marks, and this deck is essentially just doing its best Zoo Light impression. It's employing essentially the exact same strategy. You're playing some cheap early game creatures, then you're buffing everything up with your Howler, and then again with your Sing Song Satyr, and then again with your Wildfire, and finally with your Trial the Hydra. We also have some, big heavy hitting cards in here. We have Finian Fruit Bear, which could scale out of control. We have Dagon that can scale out of control. War's Wake is also here just to get wide and make use out of that like Dagon synergy. Like I said, this is essentially just like a cheap rip-off version of Light. It's doing the same thing of playing decent-sized early game creatures and buffing them. The only difference is none of these creatures are protected. In fact, a lot of them are confused. So if you want to play Light but you want to have a slightly weaker game plan but be much more green, then an aggressive nature list like this could be for you. But if you want to be aggressive, you should probably just be Light. And now we have Aggro Deception. This Aggro Deception list was made by Sprink, and this list is unique because it foregoes all guild synergy cards. We have no Selfless Guildmates, we have no Fermentary Instigators. Instead, we are basing our strategy solely on hidden creatures and buffing hidden creatures. We have some primo buff targets, including Shadow of Lethanon, Switch Duelist, Armor Lurker, Lokian Disciple, and Shadewalker. Shadewalker is probably your best buff target, does a lot of face damage. Then, of course, we have Merrick to capitalize on an existing buffed up creature, and lots of different ways to buff up said creatures. We have 2 copies of Dark Knives, a single copy of Assassin's Aim, as well as 2 Ludian Thespians. So your game plan is to play hidden creatures, ignore your opponent, hopefully they ignore you, and just have a good old-fashioned face race. If you are looking to finish your weekend ranked run in record time and interact with your opponent the bare minimum, then an Aggressive Deception deck like this could be perfect. And the last domain to discuss is Death. I have 2 different Death decks to go over today. And first, we're going to go over Party Boy Craig's Control Death deck. And this is an exciting deck because it is a new spin on an old classic. This is Board Wipe Death, but with a new win condition. See, the Board Wipe Death decks that we know and love, the ones that we're used to, they usually run Sulfuric Rains as well as Sirens and Canopic Quarters for lots of sleeping and overdrawing and milling. This deck has foregone the Sirens and the Afterlife packages. We still have the Afterlife in the sense of ramp. We have 2 Fanatics, we have 2 Ruined Asps, we have a card draw with our 1 Burrowing Scarab, our 2 copies of V-Rock, and we can double dip on those sweet Afterlives with our 2 copies of Half-Life. But in lieu of all of the sleep stuff and the Afterlife recycling, we have Trial of the Underworld, which is a card that has not seen play since it first came out and was super broken. It's an 8-mana spell. You summon a random 5-mana creature from either void, put it on your side of the board, and then repeat the process for 6 mana, 7 mana, and 8 mana creatures. So let's take a quick look at the 5, 6, 7, and 8 mana creatures the Party Boy Craig has packed into this deck. We have 2 copies of Guild Enforcer, 1 Kaya, 1 Neferu, 2 Demos, 1 Helmna, and 2 Helion Elites. So lots of stuff to bring back from Trial of the Underworld. You should be able to get your full 26 mana's worth of creatures when you play this card. And you are building, obviously, an incredibly large board. But one of my favorite part of the Trial of the Underworld thing is the Kaya, and then to a lesser extent, the Neferu. Kaya is the real flashy one. So you'll be playing a lot of big, high-static creatures, a lot of potentially front-lined creatures with your Helmna, your Helion Elite, and your Guild Enforcers. And then when you end your turn, you'll of course have spent 8 mana playing your Trial of the Underworld, and then you'll deal 8 mana to your opponent's board, or 8 damage, split amongst your opponent's board and face. So you'll be able to build an incredibly high board while destroying your opponent's side of the board, all through one great big Trial of the Hydra. Or not Trial of the Hydra, sorry, Trial of the Underworld. I might make that mistake way more times. And then besides that, we do pretty normal board wipe death things. We have a copy of Ava, which is just devastating to all the Zoo Light opponents. Zoo Light plays a lot of 1 and 2 mana creatures and then buffs them up. Ava transforms them all into zombies, and you can of course always bring Ava back with the half-life. You don't always need Canopic Hoarder. And then we have our big board wipes that of course give Board Wipe Death its name. We have the Bifracturing Curse, which can destroy all even or all odd number creatures, and of course Apocalypse Now that destroys everything, always, no matter what, all the time. So this is definitely a fun new take. Oh, also, I almost forgot, probably the flashiest part of this whole deck. As you can see, we have 2 copies of Return to Caves, which is not uncommon for a controlled death deck. Controlled decks like to be able to heal a lot, but we also have a Helmna in here. And if you don't know, Helmna gains power equal to the amount that you've healed. So if your Helmna is on the board, able to attack, and you have 10 or less health, you can play 2 Return to Caves, heal for 20, and give your Helmna plus 20 attack for a super mega kill turn. Could be very cool, but the real question is this new controlled death deck better than Anubian Death? And unfortunately the answer is probably no, so let's talk Anubian Death. This Anubian Death deck was made by 1111. It is a fairly standard Anubian Death deck. It has a lower curve. As you know, Anubians fit into 3 categories. There's Aggressive Anubian, Mid-Range Afterlife Anubians, and Control Anubians. They all have the exact same win condition of play all your Anubians and kill them off, but these more aggressive ones are better for dealing with Light's board. And of course we have 2 copies of Skull Scepter, which is really great in these aggressive metas. If you play against a Zoolite opponent, you'll be making lots of trades all throughout the game, and you can capitalize on them even further than you normally do with the Skull Scepter. We also have a copy of Curse of Greed, which is good for destroying Light's buffed up creatures. It's also good for getting rid of out of its miseried creatures, which are becoming more common, but Light sort of eclipses every other god in terms of popularity. We also have Neferu, good for dealing with Light boards. So if you want to play an Anubian Death deck, I would recommend a nice low curve one like this, and the game is nice and quickly before your Zoolite opponents can buff too hard, or your Control Light opponents can do all their shenanigans. So, yeah, let's jump into the conclusion. Alright, so it is conclusion time. We've done all the thinking, we've done all the talking, we've looked at all the decks. What should we play this weekend ranked in Gods Unchained? Well, first and foremost, you should go to the Gods Unchained Discord and vote for me, Kasha, and the Professor for the Council of the Gods. But for the weekend ranked, you should probably play some variation of Light. You can try Relic War, you can even try Control Magic, but no matter what you're doing, unless you're playing Light, you are swimming against the tide. But whatever deck you go with, try to have fun, tell us how you did in the TST Discord, and have a wonderful day. Hey, you! Did you know that subscribing to the TST YouTube channel will increase your win rate by 6.9%? So what are you waiting for? Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for notifications. And while you're at it, equip Scythe of the Harvest and attack the like button directly in the face. Bye-bye!